me go ahead and do that. Okay, I believe the recording is on. So thank you again for coming today. The purpose of this event is just to learn more about how to seek out, apply for, secure, and really excel in externally funded fellowships as graduate students. So we've invited several panelists to share their experiences and their insights about graduate fellowships. And our panelists have experience with specific fellowships in specific disciplines, but we hope that you leave us some suggestions and tips that will be useful no matter what your discipline or what funding source that you're looking for. So as far as the organization of this event, we're going to start with some introductions of the panelists. And then I'll pose the first few questions to the panelists just to get things moving. And after that, we'll allow you to pose any questions that you have. You can feel free to either at that point unmute yourself and use your audio, or you're welcome to do a chat message to everyone. Or if you prefer it be an anonymous question, you're welcome to send a chat to me and I can just read it out without your name. If we do run out of audience questions, I also have some just prepared questions additionally that we could ask the group. So I'd like to start out the event by just asking each panelist to tell us a little bit about their professional background or interests, their current role, and any experience that they have related to fellowships. So Amy, I'm just going alphabetical based on name. Would you like to start?
Sorry about that. I'm Amy Cooper. I'm in the Office of Research and Innovation, where I'm the Assistant Director of Proposal Development, and I have helped a lot of grad students with fellowship applications, and it's one of my favorite parts of my job.
Great, thank you. Elise?
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Amity, for organizing this. My name is Elise Clerkin. I'm an associate professor in psychology, and my research background is in anxiety disorders and substance use disorders. And I have experienced both when I was a graduate student a million years ago, and then also with current graduate students, including Sarah Dreyer-Oren, in competing for and securing federal funding and other types of fellowships as well.
Perfect, thank you. Rick, I think you're up next.
All right, well, hi everyone. My name is Rick Page, and thank you, Amity, for organizing this and everyone for attending. So I'm a professor in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry, started here at Miami in 2013. I'm also a faculty fellow in the Office of Research and Innovation, so I get to work with Amy, which is fantastic. And yeah, my experience with fellowships was both as a graduate student getting a fellowship and then also a postdoctoral fellow getting a fellowship.
Wonderful, thank you. And Sarah.
Hi, everybody. I'm excited to be here. My name is Sarah, and I am a 6th year graduate student in clinical psychology here at Miami. And I'm also a pre-doctoral intern right now at the VA Ann Arbor. And I am advised by Elise Clerkin, who is here. And my research is in anxiety and substance use disorders and positive emotion regulation. And my experience with fellowships, I was grateful to be assisted by Dr. Clerkin and Amy Cooper last year in securing an F31 from NIAAA/NIH.
Great, thank you so much for all those excellent introductions. So the first question I want to pose to the group, and what I've told the panelists is just that not everyone will respond to every question, may not have a response to every question. So I'll pose a couple of questions, and those of you who have a response, feel free to chime in. And the first question is, what is a fellowship? So what types of fellowships are available for graduate students, or what are some examples of graduate fellowships? So if there is someone on the session today that just doesn't really know, they're just here to learn more, but they really don't know that much about graduate fellowships, what would you share with them? Would anyone like to start? Let's see. How about Amy? You've got a lot of experience with this. You want to start, take the lead on that one?
Yep, I was just reaching for my unmute.
Perfect.
So a fellowship typically covers things like a stipend and may cover living expenses. Typically, they're for a specific research project. So you have a specific research question that you're trying to address in this project. the one that I have the most experience with is the one that Sarah did, which is the F31, which is Ruth Kirstein Fellowship from NIH. And I typically work with students in biology and psychology on those.
Thanks. Any other responses about different types of fellowships or what fellowships are? Anyone else want to add to that?
I think I'd also add that from time to time, they can also provide travel funds for the student, right? So if you have expenses that you need to go to an archive, for example, to work on your research, or, if you do field research, like, happens in biology quite a bit, those fellowships from time to time can also help pay for travel expenses that are related to the research.
Yeah, and the only other thing I would add, and I welcome people correcting me on this if I'm wrong about this, but my understanding, you sort of think about grants and fellowships, and that grants are often very much focused, I think, on funding a specific project, whereas fellowships are often very much focused on funding the applicant themselves. So for example, I have a student who has a NSF, a National Science Foundation award, and I would sort of put that into the fellowship category as well. But both, they're very interlocking together.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So the second question I'll pose, and then after this, we can open it up if there are other questions from the audience. How can graduate students find potential fellowship opportunities? So what are some ways, for those of you who've had them, maybe ways that you've searched for them, or those who assist graduate students in finding them? If students aren't aware of a specific fellowship opportunity, how might they find some of these opportunities?
I was going to say, typically, you'll belong to one or more professional societies in your discipline, right? And those are really good resources. From time to time, those individual societies will have fellowships themselves, but a lot of times they will have, collated resources of what are fellowships in that discipline that, people in your area typically apply for. So those can be a really good place to start.
I would add also that through the Office of Research and Innovation, we have a search engine that you're welcome to use to look for fellowships, and you can set some parameters in there to try and limit the results you get to fellowships that grad students are eligible for. Also, I know Amity has a nice list of some fellowship opportunities. And I also found one, if you Google North Carolina State Graduate Fellowships, they have a really nice list there that, a lot of times people only talk about the STEM fellowships, but they have a broader list that includes other disciplines as well.
Yeah, that's great, Amy. And I did just put in the chat a list. I had asked the panelists for examples of fellowship opportunities before the event. And so I put some of those in the chat just in case you're interested in like what are we talking about? What types of examples are there? Amy, if they're interested in using the search engine that you mentioned through the Office of Research and Innovation, how do they find out more about that? Is that on your website?
It is, and I will put a link in the chat.
Perfect. And Sarah, I think I saw that you were about to have a response. Sorry, I think I jumped in too early.
Oh, no worries. Another way that I think one could find fellowships, besides asking obviously your advisor or people in your program, is looking at the CVs of researchers that you admire. People will never not list a fellowship that they got on their CV. And so just look at that people that you know in the field whose careers you think maybe you would want, and you might find a fellowship there that you might be interested in.
Oh, thank you. I apologize. My when I put the information in the chat, it got cut off. So I just put the rest of the examples in there. So I do have some additional questions, but I wanted to see if the audience had any questions. So does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask the panelists? You're welcome to either unmute yourself or put something in the chat. So we have a question. Thank you for the question, Marie. What does the application process for a fellowship typically look like? That's a great question. Anyone feel like they can address that one?
Yeah, great question. I think it varies widely depending on what is the fellowship that you're applying for. So maybe Sarah can talk about the F31 process, which is kind of a process that involves both coming up with a huge research plan and a huge training plan. But there's other fellowships like the NSF that are much more circumscribed in terms of just being a couple of pages about a potential project and a couple of pages about you as an applicant. Almost always there are letters of recommendation involved, usually around 3 letters of recommendation, in addition to oftentimes, particularly with some of the really big fellowships like the NSF or the NRSA, the faculty mentor also has a kind of big component that they're responsible for as well, talking about their role in the training plan. But again, you know, it's hard to say what a typical fellowship looks like because I think they do vary so widely. As just one other example, I have a student right now who's applying for an APA fellowship, and that fellowship again looks quite different from the other 2 fellowships in terms of what is required. So I would take a look at the specific fellowships that you might be interested in. And then one of the ways that I have written fellowships in the past, and I always encourage my students to do, is to get lots and lots and lots of examples from other students or other people who have written a similar fellowship.
Great response. Sarah, did you want to mention anything about the application process that you went through?
Yeah, I mean, I think Dr. Clerkin kind of covered most of what I would say, but at least for an F31, there's, as was said, a big research plan or describing the study that you want to run, a big training plan, which is describing kind of how the fellowship would benefit your training. And then there are a lot of other documents. And in addition to getting letters of recommendation, you also need a consultant team. So contacting other researchers who are willing to write letters saying that they will be consultants on your fellowship and help you enact that training plan. So in terms of thinking about timelines, those backs and forths of asking people, getting the answers back, and then drafting with them the documents that they would need to put in your application can take quite some time. And then there's also the administrative piece, which Amy, you can talk more about as well. But once you actually have the things written for an NIH fellowship, you aren't going to be the one actually clicking the buttons to submit it. You need to work with the Miami Grants end of things to get it submitted. So that takes an additional amount of time.
And Sarah, I'm sure you would agree with me that no one would ever regret starting, no one would ever feel they started too early on the process.
Never. Absolutely.
And the NERSA that you were funded on, that's the most grueling application that I know of. There are more pieces to that than basically any grant proposal that faculty ever submit. It's a huge undertaking. And I think it's really important that number one, you start as early as you can, and don't be intimidated by the guidelines. They're huge and they're daunting. At first, you might not understand some terms in there. Just keep plugging through it. And if we have different staff who work with different disciplines, but you can always start with me asking questions, and then I'll refer you to somebody else if needed. And yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, the only other thing I wanted to add, because I'm sure if you're anything like me listening to this, you might be feeling really overwhelmed by the amount of work. And I do think it's worth mentioning that, you know, the first grant, the first fellowship you write is always going to be the hardest. And I think that just is what it is. But I think once you tackle that, if you're in this field, it's going to pay dividends down the line in terms of being able to really not only benefit from that exact work, the direct work, but also kind of pulling from what you've done for future applications as well. It's never going to feel as daunting again once you, and part of the reason why I think then it's so valuable to work on fellowships when you're a student or when you're a postdoc is because then you get to do it in a really nice mentored way. So then when it comes to, writing your own grants in the future, you'll really be able to hit the ground running.
Great. Well, we have several more questions now. So one of them is about timelines. Are there timelines for these fellowships?
We at Miami don't really have official timelines that you need to follow in terms of when you get pieces submitted to our office or anything like that. In terms of the funder, each funder is different on the deadlines and whether there's only one a year or more than one. So like I said, you want to start as early as possible, and then you work in our system that's called Cayuse. And once you get all your pieces uploaded in there, which I or someone on our staff will show you how to do. And once you've done all that, then the staff member will go through and check every single piece of that, which I think now usually takes me maybe 3 hours. And typically I then go back to the student with sometimes a page full of notes on things that need to be addressed before we can submit the application. So you need to build in a lot of time for that back and forth. And that's after you've had, your advisor has read it 10 times and you've got input from everyone else and you've got your letters together.
Great. That's very helpful. And there were a couple other questions about what office supports this work and can help students with this. And I know, Amy, you mentioned, so for example, is there someone in the Office for Research that can help us to plan our applications and review them once we have them ready to go? It sounds like, Amy, it's someone in your office, either you or one of your colleagues, if it's a different discipline that you don't cover, is able to do that. Do students typically reach out to your office directly, graduate students, or is it through their advisors, or how do you recommend they get started if they have a fellowship in mind and they're interested in connecting?
I think it's best for the student to reach out directly to us and always mention who your advisor is, because that's kind of how we classify the workload. What else did you ask there, Amity?
Oh, geez, I had so much in the question. Now I can't remember. I think you got it. Just confirmation that that they would reach out. I guess, would they all reach out to you first and you would then let them know if it's actually someone else that they should be consulting with? Okay.
Yep, that's fine. Or else their advisor will know who they typically work with in the office. One other thing I wanted to mention is that your advisor is your biggest resource. And folks in our office do not read actual narrative sections. I sometimes skim them a bit, but the actual narrative content of your application is between you and your advisor. So what I'm looking for are technical issues that could get your application thrown out.
I would add on top of that. So, right. So Office of Research Innovation is there, right? Making sure that your application is going to go through, that it's not going to get sent back because of administrative reasons, but you should definitely be working not only with your faculty advisor, but also other faculty that and even people outside your discipline to read the different components you have, right? So, there's like a research proposal of what the project is you're going to do, but there's typically like a personal statement, right? Different, training plans that you have to write. Those are things that you absolutely want to have someone else read and have multiple other people, multiple eyes look at those to make sure, one, that they make sense, that there's no grammatical errors, everything like that. The longer and longer that you work on a document on your own, the less and less, just as humans, that we are able to see what errors are in things.
And an old grant writing trick is always have someone outside your discipline read it, in addition to those who will understand your research, because that unknowledgeable reader will pick up on different things.
Another resource that I don't want any grad students to forget about is the Writing Center. It is free. People who are willing to freely edit your writing, and they are getting paid for it, but not being paid by you. So you can imagine that that is an ideal situation, especially if you're looking for somebody outside of your field to read it. I believe you can still choose who you want as your Writing Center tutor for any given session. You can also sign up for, or you used to be able to, I'm not sure how it's working in the pandemic, but you can sign up for weekly sessions. You cannot, if it's something like an NRSA, you cannot expect someone to review all your NRSA documents in 1 week, because it is many, many, many pages, but you could kind of split it up and work with your own timeline to have some accountability for editing there.
Excellent, great ideas. There was another question in the chat, and I don't know if anyone can speak to this, about some of the fellowship opportunities do have requirements for citizenship or residency. And are there any suggestions related to that? Or is there any way to get, I don't know, the questions that circumvent that? Does anyone have any suggestions, or the requirements, what they are? Rick? Yeah,
I mean, so for most of the federal funded graduate fellowships, there's no way to circumvent those. You know, the citizenship restrictions they have, or the restrictions that they have. The way to address that is to go after other types of fellowships. So a lot of the private foundations, so I had a American Heart Association graduate fellowship and also a postdoctoral fellowship, and those fellowships do not have, or at least the ones from the American Heart Association, did not have citizenship requirements at all. And so that's one of the things to look for, and typically it's going to be private foundations that do not have those same restrictions.
Yeah, and I know that was something we were sensitive to when trying to come up with that list, because it is a barrier and it's a challenge for our international students. So there's a couple on that list. And then I would also encourage you to look into any fellowships from your country of origin as well, where I know that that's something people have been successful with as well. But, you know, again, I think when the NIH and NSF are just very obvious fellowships, but once you get beyond those, it is a lot more idiosyncratic in terms of what are the specific fellowships that are going to be missing, that are going to be meeting your specific qualifications, that you have your specific citizenship as well.
Great. And feel free, those of you who are in attendance, feel free to continue to put questions in the chat or unmute yourself. I think we've answered all the questions in there right now. I have a couple others that I can pose. Oh, here we go. Great. Belinda, thank you. What are the differences between grad and postdoc fellowships? Great question. For which level or years of program can you apply? Anyone feel that they could address that one?
I mean, I think the main difference has to do with what is your period of training that you're at. So for example, with the fellowship that we keep talking about, the F31, which is the graduate level fellowship through the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, there is a corresponding F32 fellowship that is for postdoctoral fellows. And so what that fellowship does is it funds your training when you are a postdoctoral student. And so it really just depends on what is your level of training, and you're typically, at least in clinical psychology, you would be applying for the F31 while you are a graduate student, and then the F32 would either be while you're a graduate student in your final year, you're applying to get funding for postdoc, or I've sometimes seen people apply for that postdoc when they are already on postdoc to fund additional years. But I think regardless, with those types of fellowships, you really need to show here's the type of training that I need, the additional training above and beyond what I've already gotten in my specific program. I hope that answers the question.
Excellent, great response. So I'm curious, how competitive are fellowships? Does this vary drastically? I don't know, the fellowships that you have experience with, does anyone know how competitive they are, how likely a student might be to receive a fellowship? I know it probably varies dramatically, but any insights you have for students who are wondering about that?
It dawns on me that I don't really have any statistics on funding rates for fellowships, and of course they vary widely. I would say they're pretty darn competitive, though.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the rates are published. So I believe that for NIH fellowships, I don't, if you Google like fellowship funding rates or NRSA funding rates, and then it's going to vary by institute. Like I think the NIMH, which is National Institute of Mental Health, is a little bit more competitive, I think, than like NIDA, which is the National Institute of Drugs. But yeah, so I think it does vary a lot. I think that I could be wrong, and so correct me if I'm wrong about this, but my sense is that some of the smaller foundation grants actually wind up being more competitive because there's just a much larger, or there's a smaller number of fellowships that are awarded. And so even though it's not as many people who are applying, you have fewer fellowships that are available to you. But what I was always told is that this field that we've chosen of academia, there's a ton of rejection. I get rejected all the time, but you just keep putting your name in that hat, and then sometimes it's going to come through. And again, like I applied for an NSF early on in graduate school, didn't get funded, didn't even make any kind of mention, like I didn't get honorable mention or anything like that. But then I was able to use that information for future kind of internal grants and fellowships that I applied for. And so I would just say, keep trying and something will come through. I wouldn't worry too much about what the actual percentages of who gets funded are.
Great. And we have a really good question from Erica. So do you typically apply for one fellowship at a time, kind of like you would submit one journal article at a time, or do you apply to many, like you would apply to many graduate schools? What's the best practice there?
That is a very good question. I know that a lot of applications, there's just a box that you check if you're applying elsewhere at the same time, but I think that some funders will have restrictions and want you to only be submitting to one place at a time. Does anybody else know anything about that?
I mean, I think it's okay to submit to more than one thing at a time, but I think it would be almost impossible to submit to multiple huge fellowships at a time. I think what I see much more commonly is that people may take a tiny little chunk of one of the things that they're working on, and they use that to apply to something else that's much more low-hanging fruit. And I think that seems to work well for people.
And something we haven't talked about yet is the idea of resubmitting your application after rejection. And so what I was thinking is that you can use your reviewer comments from one funder to refine and hone your idea, and then you can either resubmit to the same funder, or you can use that to submit to other funders too. But those reviewer comments are like gold. They're the most important thing you'll get. And on a resubmission, your chance of being funded goes up very dramatically. So always keep that in mind. If you get that first rejection, it's not the end of the world.
And I will say, in the spirit of not wasting your hard work, if you can apply for grants and a fellowship at the same time and reuse some of that material. I'm sure there are restrictions in some scenarios, but you can definitely be applying for smaller grants to fund the actual project that you want to be doing, and reuse some of the work that you've done for the fellowship application to apply for those grants.
Great. So there's another question about, is there, with graduate school admissions, for example, a lot of programs admit at one point in the year, certain time of the year, and it's a kind of a standard cycle. Is that similar? Are a lot of fellowships, do they accept applications at the same time of the year, or does it just depend on the funder and just kind of vary when that is?
It really depends very much on the funder. And as I said earlier, some funders like NIH will have multiple deadlines throughout the year. And some students might get stuck in this rut of, oh, the next deadline's only 4 months away. I'll wait until the next time. And then they just keep waiting and waiting. I thought I had another thing to say about that, and I've lost my train of thought. Anyone else on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, you got to look around at the fellowship opportunities that are there. I've seen there's a bunch of them that are due in the July timeframe. The NIH ones are usually due a couple times a year. The NSF, like the graduate research fellowships, are due once a year, and I think it's like the sort of like November timeframe. So you kind of got to be lookout for that. And it's really, I think it was mentioned before that you cannot start the process early enough, right? So plan ahead, because it could be almost up to like a year, almost lead time that you might need to find out, when is the deadline, what do you have to do to prepare, what are the sections that you have to put together.
I did also remember what I lost there, which is that for federal proposals especially, you need to remember that it's a 6 to 8 month time frame from when you submit to when you would be funded.
Good. So there was a question, and I realized that those who came in later may not have seen the initial list of fellowship examples that was put in the chat. So I'll put that in there again in just a minute. But there was a list or a question about, is there a list of fellowships that's available by department or content or topic, or is there some sort of clearinghouse? I will put in, there's a list of some examples that we threw together before this panel, but I'll open it up to others about whether they're aware of other lists by discipline or by content topic. And Amy, I don't know if this relates to the database that people have access through your office. So I'll let you, anyone else who wants to comment on that.
So definitely you can search in our Grant Forward database for opportunities. And if you need some help getting started with that, I put a link into that search engine in the chat. If you need help getting started in there, I can help you. But your advisors always know of the most common opportunities in your area. What else? Oh, professional societies. I think Rick mentioned earlier that sometimes they offer their own fellowships, and they also may have lists that would be relevant to your discipline.
Perfect, thank you. And I will go ahead and put that in the chat. I'm going to put the Grant Forward information again, because I think when people come in later, they're not able to see the prior information in the chat. So I've got that in there now. Let's see. Were there any other questions in the chat? Okay, so someone asked about grants versus fellowships. That was discussed earlier, and it looks like Elise put a great link in there to help differentiate that. I don't see any other questions in the chat.
Sorry, I was gonna say, can I, sorry.
Absolutely, go ahead, yes.
Sorry, I think I was talking and I was muted.
Oh, sorry.
So I just wanna say though, in response to that question about the difference between grants and fellowships, is that I don't think it's super clear. I think we do use these terms interchangeably. And I think even the definition that I gave at the outset is a little bit contradicting what that link I just sent. And so I think that I wouldn't worry too much about the distinction of what's a grant versus what the fellowship is. I think I would just be focused more on getting yourself funding, whether that's called a fellowship or whether that winds up being called a grant, and then paying attention to is this pocket of money going to pay me, Elise Clerkin, to do whatever I want, or is it going to pay me to do this very specific research project and this very specific set of things? And whatever it's called, ultimately that's what's important, is to know what is that money being used for.
So I'd like to ask a question. A lot of this time has been spent talking about how to get a fellowship. What do you do when you actually have it? What's it like? So I don't know what's rewarding about it. You know, what's the benefit of like putting in all this work that you all have been talking about to apply for this fellowship? Other, you know, what is the real benefit and maybe any challenges? So someone who's had a fellowship, maybe you want to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I mean, so in my experience having a fellowship, it was really like the freedom that it gives you, right? Because you're not then tied to necessarily the funding that your advisor has. So different disciplines do it a little bit differently. You know, the discipline, you know, structural biology, chemistry that I'm in, you don't necessarily just get to work on whatever you want. But what it did, you know, in both graduate school and then also in my postdoctoral experience, was it let me keep going as a research assistant when I was a graduate student. So I was just doing research. I wasn't having to teach because I had that fellowship that was bringing that money for my stipend in, right? And where if I hadn't had that, I would not have had the opportunity to be a research assistant. And then in the postdoctoral fellowship, what it did was allowed me to stay a little bit longer where I was and finish up that project because the funding wasn't necessarily there for me to stay for as long as I needed to. So it really gives you like that flexibility. You are bringing the funding for yourself, and it really helps you build for your career after graduate school and after your postdoctoral fellowship as well.
Yeah, completely. I just think the freedom is just incredible when you're used to, you know, having to teach every semester or do clinical, whatever it is that you're doing to get your funding. And then all of a sudden you can just do your research. And I don't know that there's any other time in your career when you're going to really have that level of freedom and flexibility. And then kind of similar to what Rick mentioned, it's both the kind of direct impact of it allows you to publish and, you know, do all of those things, but also, you know, when people see that on your CV, it's impressive. People know what that means. People in this field know what that means, and it really does open doors for you. I remember on an interview once, somebody telling me that they didn't even, which I actually think this is not normal and it wasn't appropriate for them to say this and it's kind of weird, but they said, you know, they don't even look at applicants that don't have this particular fellowship. And I don't think that's true for most places, but I think that just highlights the kind of what it means to have some of those types of fellowships.
Great, very helpful. So there was a question about, is there a time limit to use the funding if you get a fellowship? And I assume there is on most fellowships. So maybe if you could get, if anyone has an example of like, what was your fellowship time period or the fellowships that you're aware of, what's a typical time period?
Sarah, do you want to comment on how long your NRSA is?
Yeah, so I can say a little bit about what I think most like max lengths of funding for a lot of these fellowships that we've been talking about, I think is 3 years. I know for NSF, I believe that's the case. And I believe that's also the case for the NRSA. When people have been saying over and over again, it's never too early to start working on your fellowship. I wish that I had started earlier. So I was funded in this winter of last year, and only ended up holding the funding because I wasn't allowed to be paid by 2 places, and now I'm being paid by the VA until this summer. So it was a short span that I was funded by the fellowship. I still get a lot of the benefits, networking with the people that were on my consulting team, but that was my time frame. I think 3 years is the max that I've heard any fellowship being able to last for, but it can obviously be shorter than that.
I'd say mine were both 2 years that I had, but it just depends on the which fellowship you get.
Perfect. Another question, is it worth doing a fellowship that if it extends your time that you're a doctoral student? Any thoughts?
It really depends. I mean, I think that's a personal value judgment for yourself, you know, to determine, you kind of weigh those pros and cons. I was in a little bit of a different boat than Sarah, but a somewhat similar boat where I got an NRSA my final year of grad school, and I decided to just go ahead and go on internship anyways, because I, you know, for personal reasons, it was important for me to move along. But I think it would also be a perfectly good decision to say, I want to stay for an extra year and just have no responsibilities other than research, which is glorious. You know, that's a pretty beautiful setup too. So I think, again, it's not that there's a good or bad answer there. It's really, what is your values? What is it that you want to do?
Yeah, that's great. And having conversations with your advisor and people in your discipline will probably help you to come to a judgment on that as well. So great. Does anyone have examples of funded proposals that can be shared? I don't know if that's something that the Office of Research and Innovation keeps that is available publicly, or if that's just something that graduate students need to maybe ask their advisor or other graduate students who have pursued these opportunities. Does anyone know? Or I do think maybe some funders may have examples of funded applications perhaps available. Amy, do you
Some
have
funders do have those examples. Our office does not maintain a library of funded proposals, but we've talked about it. And we never share a proposal without the PI's permission. And so I usually send students back to their advisor to ask who else they know that has submitted to find an example.
One resource that I've seen to be very generous, I haven't actually attempted this myself, but academic Twitter, if you are on academic Twitter, is filled with people saying, I want to apply for this in this field. Can anyone give me an example of their materials or be willing to share their materials? And obviously being really appreciative to people who say yes to that. But I think it's really helpful to have examples that are within your sphere of field. And so that's a really good place to find it.
Yeah, I'm always happy to share examples. And if people want to reach out to me directly, I'd be more than happy to share. At this point, my NRSA again is like, you know, very outdated, but I could always be in touch with my grad students to ask if they were willing to share as well.
Great, excellent tips. Thank you. I think that's all the questions in the chat. Are there other questions right now? Well, maybe a final question. If anything else comes up, please put it in the chat. I know we said this would last till 4, but I think we got a lot accomplished. I feel like there was a lot of great questions. If we don't have any more, I'll ask one final question, but feel free to continue to think. We have 15 more minutes. If you have anything else, put it in the chat. My final question to the group might be, you know, if any final advice. So we've talked a lot about fellowships, about a lot of different aspects. So any final advice, something that you think hasn't maybe been said yet, or something you think should be reiterated, and maybe each of the panelists might be able to share something, final advice to graduate students who are considering pursuing a fellowship. Anyone want to start? How about we could go alphabetically again. Amy, is it okay? Do you all have some final piece of advice you could share? Okay, Amy, do you want to start?
I would say, in addition to starting early, don't be afraid to ask questions. So many grad students will say to me, I'm sorry for bothering you. And you're not bothering me at all. That's my job, and I'm very happy to help.
Wonderful. Elise, anything?
Yeah, just go for it if you want to do this. I think that by virtue of being in this panel and being at Miami University, you can apply. I think I would hope that, I think it's very daunting at the outset to look at people that are accomplished and have done different things and to feel, well, I don't belong there, or I'm not capable of that. And I think you are. And I think you especially are, because you're at an institution that's going to have a team that is going to help you with that. And so I think developing your team, developing those mentors and colleagues to help you is really critical.
Great. Rick, anything?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. Just absolutely go for it, right? I mean, it's a fantastic opportunity to really like step back and think about your project, right? So even if you don't get a fellowship, it is a great opportunity to really, critically think about how you're approaching your project, what you're going to do, start planning things out more kind of long-term, big picture. And then from there, I think one of the things that we kind of briefly touched on, but did not touch on a whole lot was letters of recommendation, right? So you're typically going to need 3 letters of recommendation. One of those will, by pretty much every single fellowship, is going to require one of those letters to be from your advisor or your mentor, right? It is, I'd say, even if the fellowship doesn't require that, it's, in reviewing those applications, it's odd and it just looks strange if a graduate student is applying for a fellowship, or a postdoc is applying for a fellowship, and their advisor is not one of the letters, right? I mean, so you definitely work with your advisor, and plan in advance, how are you going to, when you're going to apply, and all that. And then the other part is to really like supply your letter one is choose people who know you and what you do, right? And they don't all have to be at Miami. They can be from other institutions, other places that you've worked. But you really want to do is supply them with the information that they're going to need in order to write a good letter, right? So if you have a draft of, there's a personal statement, like giving them a draft of what that personal statement's going to be, giving them even a rough copy of what that research proposal is going to look like, right? Giving them a copy of your CV, giving them information to help them write a good letter, and being clear and direct to them is, here's where you submit the letter, here's how you submit it, here's when it's due, giving them plenty of time. If you give them that information, that's going to help them write a letter. And I've always told students that a happy letter writer is a good letter writer, right? So make it easy on those people. They're going to be writing those letters for you, because you want those letters to be strong.
Great advice. Sarah, any last advice for the group as someone who just has gone through this recently yourself?
Yeah, I would echo the advice to try as best you can to quell any kind of imposter syndrome or self-doubt. Even if it's competitive, even if 10% of fellowships get funded, I think usually they're higher rates than that, but that's 10 out of 100 people who are getting them. So somebody is getting them. It very well might be you. And I had one more thing that I was going to say. Oh, in addition to kind of like starting early in a more micro sense, like if you're applying for something due in April of one year, like starting maybe in the April of the year prior, I also think just starting earlier in your graduate career. There are fellowships that are only available in your, I think, first or second year is what NSF is restricted to now. But even applying to an F31, maybe in your second year, can give you a lot of freedom, a lot of time to have that freedom, and maybe not even extending your doctoral studies. So I think that starting early in a macro sense is also really effective. And then at the very least, you've applied, you have the experience. And I have heard that even that looks good on a CV, even if you're not funded, to be able to say that you applied. You can potentially, if you're scored, have a score on there, and that is well evaluated.
That's a great point. Thank you. And we do actually have one more question that came in. I don't know if anyone can respond to this one. Any insight on applying for a fellowship or grant from a foreign institution or government office? Does anyone have any experience with that?
The only experience I have is that I got to be a consultant participant on a grant that was out of India. And but I was not the PI on that grant, but I think there were a lot of similarities to some of the grants that you might do in the United States. And so I think that, I guess I just share that I've been involved just to say it's possible. And I think it was one of the best experiences that I had in my academic career, even though again, I was not the PI or even particularly important on this grant, but I think it wound up being just a really amazing opportunity for all the folks in the psych department. Vaishali Raval was the PI of that grant, and really it fostered some really amazing work.
We had a student in the past, I guess it was about a year and a half ago, who applied for and got a Marie Curie fellowship. So it's like through the European Union. And it really, what really seemed to be influential there was like essentially having like a target lab. So this was for a postdoctoral fellowship that she went off and did in Europe after grad school. And so having that target lab that she was going to work for there and working with them and be able to basically get advice directly from them and examples from them of past applications that they had seen come through. Those are really kind of your best bets there in terms of trying to get information from people who have participated in that process before.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, I think we've answered all the questions that were there. So thank you so much to the panelists for coming today. I'm just amazed at all the great advice and experiences that you shared. And thanks to all of the participants who attended. If you have any questions afterwards, feel free, you can reach out to me. It seems like Amy has volunteered. You can reach out to her, and other panelists. I don't know if it's okay or not. Maybe thumbs up if it's okay, if anyone has a question afterwards. Okay, perfect. So we appreciate it. Thank you so much. And we hope you all have a great day.
Thank you, Amity.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming. Appreciate it. You guys have a good night.